Firstly, I am going to look at social class and inequality. What do we mean when we talk about inequality and social class? When we look at social class, we refer to divisions of people based on their social, economic, and capital status within the society. This idea of segregation between individuals in society can then create a gap which leads to inequality within the nations in all aspects of life, including education. When looking at social class, there are two main dominant theories by Karl Marx and Max Weber. Karl Marx looked at the relationship between society and economics, where he argued that social class was formed on the relationship to labour, meaning work, and also if they owned capital. He divided these into two classes. Firstly, the working class, meaning the factory labour workers who did not own capital and did not have much of a say. And secondly, the capital class, which were people who owned and controlled the systems. A Marxist theorist, Elusather, coined the term ideological state apparatus, where he believed that the institutions such as schools circulate ideas which control the population of people and therefore allow the power to be maintained. The schools began to socialize populations into different norms and beliefs and different levels of education, and then sorted people into occupations which connected social class to education. It aimed to maintain order and reproduce capitalist relations of production. Max Weber's theory was based on four separate classes: the upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, and then the working class. He believed that class was not just based on your occupation and capital status, but more so on your honour, wealth, political power, and your status within society. Weber referred to life chances, which referred to opportunities for social advancement where people have different access to resources. Weber's idea of life chances takes this out of play and disputes the idea that people are stuck to one class for their entire life. Life chances can definitely affect education, as a student may advance themselves with their education in order to improve their status, power, and wealth within the society, therefore breaking out of their current social status, using life chances in order to better their social class, creating upward social mobility rather than a downward spiral. The idea of life chances challenged the notion of the privileged student. The privileged student being considered to have an advantage due to their parents' social class, where they may have access to more educational resources and assets that can assist their education and bring more opportunity with them, such as job opportunities once they've graduated. Weber also addresses how this life chance can influence students who are already considered privileged or disadvantaged. How does a disadvantaged student pull themselves to an upper class status without access to any adequate resources and education as an already privileged student may have? I believe that if a student is dedicated enough to their studies to want to better their education and life in certain aspects, they will take necessary measures in order to learn. With the right teachers and drive, they will still be able to open to life chances and change their social class, as Weber stated. This concept of disadvantaged and privileged students is something that we as a society have fostered ourselves without even really realizing. It is common for many people to refer to a particular suburb or geographic area as a low or high socioeconomic status, privileged or disadvantaged depending on the location of this area. We as a society and individuals are very quick to judge someone's personality based on their living location or what their occupation may be. We have created a high level of social segmentation and difference in performance at schools, partly due to geography and the fact that we as a nation have a significantly high number of non-government schools. This divide between public and private schooling has also created the ideas and notions behind the disadvantaged and privileged students and their access to resources and better or worse education. As I mentioned earlier, I still believe that schools and education can enhance life chances and therefore create intergenerational changes in social class and upward social mobility, creating more educated and knowledgeable society willing to change their social class. As a previous student of a private school, I personally experienced the advantages of a private school and what it can bring and also the opportunities that I was offered. Even after graduating, there has always been a sense of camaraderie, as we have a saying, once a St. Pat's girl, always a St. Pat's girl. I first-hand experienced the social capital resources and support available to me through networking of this school, even once I graduated. I did notice that coming from this considered higher end school for my area, that we were expected to know more, do more, and were being taught in certain ways to groom us for our future careers that were deemed acceptable and the right thing to do. And that if you were to stray, you were considered a lost cause. The idea of Bernstein's educational codes addresses how practice and knowledge is valued in educational domains. For example, we are told that in a HSC, a physics or business studies student will be awarded and scaled a higher ATAR than someone who chooses a more creative subject, such as visual arts, music, or woodwork. I personally chose to do visual arts and music as I was receiving great marks in these subjects and knew if I chose something such as physics, I would fail, as I don't excel in those areas. It is the concept that historically more values and standards have been applied to these subjects compared to other creative subjects. I believe that there is definitely a strong divide between public and private schools within Australia, and I truly believe that this is strongly connected to social status and our access to resources, our upbringing, and our parents' relationship to school. Public schools were brought in by the government in order to create equity for all students to have the same education with the same curriculum, so that each student had a fair chance, and also to create human capital, meaning that the nation would benefit more if all were educated and not just people who had money. I do not believe that this has become the case. From completing my practicums, I can definitely see the divide between social classes, how students are treated, taught, and also access to resources and networking, especially within the final 2 years of your schooling before joining the workforce. I also see how Australia wants to believe that we are a meritocratic society with our fair go mate ideologies, but in reference to education, I do not believe this is the case at all. We do not acknowledge this divide between social class and inequality in any sense, especially in education, nor do we relate educational learning and social class as a society. Weber's idea of life chances is plausible, but only if that student truly believes that they can succeed no matter where they go to school. Schools and education can enhance a student's social mobility if both the teacher and student are dedicated and willing to push the social class boundaries and not feel tied to one social class to life. As we are all aware, gender refers to the lived experiences of men and women in particular contexts within a social aspect. The notions of gender vary over time historically and can also vary between cultural societies. The social ideas of gender are not born into a child but are socially produced by the people surrounding them and their ideas and beliefs. Throughout history, one of the main gender ideologies we have seen is women joining the feminist movement in order to exercise women's rights and control over the inequality experienced just for being a woman and the social constraints felt by women. The idea that men are masculine and women are feminine is still looked at in this day and age, creating the idea of a heteronormativity, a belief that people become categorized as either male or female and assume the roles based on their gender. Vickers mentions in the chapter about growing and a significant gap between subject choices in gender, and how there are social norms formed around a more masculine and feminine-based subjects. I am positive that if we would ask students in school about certain subject choices, they would be considered either a girls or a boys subject. For example, textiles or food technology may be seen as a more feminine-based subject, as historically in our social context, it has been seen in a woman's job to knit, sew, and cook. If a male student was to be interested in these subjects or concepts, then he could possibly be considered gay or queer by his male peers. The idea of queer theory or homophobia, especially in Australia, is not just a fear of gay men, but the fear of being labelled a gay man by your peers. If these boys aren't taking part in male-dominated activities and being masculine, they are highly likely to be labelled as gay. This is another aspect that has become culturally and socially ingrained into students from a range of differentiating factors. If we as teachers are able to pull this out of students from the beginning and create new ideas of gender in school environments, it could drastically change the notions of gender within the school environment. We as educators need to challenge the notion and ideas that gender and sexual preferences are fixed. Myself personally, as a visual arts teacher, I do see more female-dominated classroom when art becomes an elective subject. Certain male students do not wish to take part in creative expression subjects, as this is not dominant or masculine. When we look at gender in school, we also have to be aware of the bullying that can be encountered by both male and females. As I mentioned earlier, male students calling other male students gay for enjoying what historically may have been a more female-dominated activity is a serious form of verbal bullying. Vickers mentions that boys are considered to show more dominant behaviours in social situations and therefore generally tend to bully one another more so than girls. Vickers also mentions that approximately 1 in 6 students a week are bullied at school. An alarming statistic. Vickers mentions that certain students will bully their peers in order to achieve a sense of power and a firm understanding of aggressive masculinity, which has been absorbed from their wider community. When discussing gender and education, we also need to look at gender organisation within the school and how we discuss gender as educators. It is important that we do not downplay gender, as this is still an important part of teaching, as we are both different. We need to be mindful that the idea of degendering may not be the best way forward for students. For example, teachers in the PDHPE department have to teach the differences between men and women, so we cannot make schools a gender-neutral place. What we can do as educators is to be aware of social norms relating to gender and create less of a divide between the two genders. When I completed my first prac, I began getting students' attention by yelling out, "Guys," addressing them all. I realised after the second day that this probably is not appropriate, as firstly it's too colloquial, and also it refers to the issue of gender. I then began gaining attention by calling out the year group instead. This helped me treat the students in a common way without being too gender specific. Not only does gender play an important role for students, but also the teachers and staff within the school. The idea of gender dimension refers to power, emotional relationships, gender jobs, and also organisational culture. It is said that some parents would prefer their child to have a male teacher, as males are associated with dominance, discipline, and structure. But as Vicker mentions, students are no more or less motivated in class dependent on the gender of their teacher. During my previous prac, I was placed at an all-girls school. I also too went to an all-girls school. While I was there, I did notice that I was able to quickly and effectively build rapport with the students. I felt connected to them and was able to feel at ease within the classroom. I do believe that this had something to do with me being younger, but also mostly that I was too female. Students were able to speak to me about female-related ideas and problems without feeling awkward. We need to be mindful that gender needs to be looked at from a point of view that distracts from the social ideas and concepts of gender and looked at from a purely educational point of view. The topic of cultural difference and identity can be a difficult one to deal with, as Australia as a nation is basically made up of migrants, apart from the Indigenous Australians. As a vastly multicultural country, we still suffer extremely from racism and cultural identity crisis. Education can be seen as an induction to culture, but what does culture and what does this entail, and how does this benefit the students? Over the history of Australia, the idea of immigrants coming to Australia and assimilating to Australian culture was just assumed. They would forget their own culture and then agree to act and live the Australian cultural life. The idea of the white British dominating the land. This ideology also ran into education, where students from a range of backgrounds were only taught the way of the Anglo-cultural norms at school. These families move over for increased life chances and better social mobility, only to be knocked down once they arrive. Only recently have we been accepting and willing to teach culture on a new level in schools. In our curriculums now, we have cross-curriculum priorities, which encompass the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, as well as Australia's and Asia's engagement, which gives teachers a way to bring into these two cultures into the classroom in many different ways. I know when I was in Year 11, I was also taught different religions such as Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. This was a great way for me to be open to different cultures, and I found this extremely intriguing. As a teacher now, I try to incorporate a range of different artists from many different cultures and also genders to expose students to different cultures and how they perceive art in their own way. When we look at cultural differences in an education setting, one of the most noticeable aspects would be language. There are many people who speak a second language or have English as a second language now within Australia. Language fosters understanding of cultures and enriches social and economic relations with one another. If we can speak a second language, we can have better communications nationwide with other cultures at high levels such as politics. If we have an understanding of their language, it makes the gaps less visible with clear communication. Welch mentions a study conducted by Klein in 2005 states there has been a rapid decrease of bilingual studies from the 19th century until today within Australia. Only 14% of students undertook language as a subject in HSC in 2010 compared to 40% in the 1960s. We have begun to not nurture this as an important subject, and possibly vital. This is partly also due to the fact that students are once again told that languages will not scale well, so it's not chosen, it's not compulsory, and Australia is a native English-speaking country, so students do not feel the need to have a second language. The idea of English speaking and speaking a second language, being bilingual, is seen as a luxury, as if you are exotic and so cultured for knowing two languages, but not something that students seem to be interested in. There is also little to no funding for languages within education. Australia has had many policies to try and pick up languages within education. Firstly, the Australian Language and Literacy Policy for priority languages, and then the second policy, the National Asian Languages and Studies in Australian Schools, which was scrapped in 2003. I find the idea that it was scrapped was so odd, considering our universities rely on international students, with most of these international students being from Asian countries, who achieve high and skilled results compared to domestic students. It seems as though they are willing to learn our ways, but we are not willing to learn theirs, which causes for miscommunication and a society who know little about their own culture and identity as well as others. I found that during my time at school, only one language was on offer, that being Italian, and unfortunately I wanted to learn Japanese but was unable to due to lack of resources and teachers willing. But while at my previous prac, students in Year 7 and 8 were learning and exposed to Japanese as a compulsory unit, with a fair few students choosing it as an elective in Year 9 and 10. I asked them why, and they said that it generally was interesting and that it was something that challenged them. When looking at cultural differences and identity, we need to be aware of the ethnic diversities within the classroom, how to cater pedagogies for all students to feel included and on task. Similar to gender, we also need to be aware and reduce the effects of racism and cultural bullying between peers and also teachers and students. Teachers need to not assume or pigeonhole students based on their race. If a teacher already assumes how a student is going to perform without actually assessing them, the student will not bother learning as they already feel excluded and have their future written out for them. We need to be mindful and respectful of one another's cultures. Our federal government needs to assist schools with incorporating culture into our curriculum, creating a safe space for all students no matter where they are from. Thank you for listening.